My name is Roy Macgregor, and I'm a sportswriter. And what am I doing up here? I've gone from ice to water. I thought I'd call the talk Over My Head, because that's where I am. And I'll tell you where it began. 3 or 4 years ago, I was asked if I would help the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, out with his hockey book. And although I came from the media, so was immediately distrusted, we eventually got along pretty well. And as time went by and the book began to take shape, he asked me one day, he said, "Would you consider writing the foreword to my hockey book?" And I said, "Yes, Prime Minister, so long as you're comfortable with me signing it Senator Roy Macgregor." Well, Nigel thought that was pretty funny. The Prime Minister thought it was pretty good. And then came this. So I was not going to be a senator. I had to find some next project to move on to. And in all the times that I had sat outside the Prime Minister's office or inside waiting for him to get out of a meeting or out of question period, there was this magnificent painting that had been loaned to the Prime Minister's office by the National Gallery called Into the Rapids by Frances Ann Hopkins. It's on the Mattawa River. And I have a pretty deep background in canoeing and the outdoors, and I thought, well, I'll write a book about canoes. And my argument was no canoe, no Canada. Eventually, we did come up with a book. And as Shelley said earlier this evening, it only is logical to say no canoe, no Canada, but no rivers, no canoe. So I started thinking rivers would be a good idea. And the Globe and Mail said, why don't you have a look at doing a book on rivers? What a great thing for a retirement project. Why don't you travel around the country, find 16 or 20 representational rivers, do the history of them, do the issues with them, do the people around them, do the First Nations side of the story, and try to tell us again about our original highways. So I first of all went to look at what material there was. And Hugh McLennan had written a book back he wrote it twice actually, in 1957 and again in 1974 about the rivers of Canada. And his vision was so uncannily bleak. Now I have to tell you, I did know this man, and he's a wonderful gentleman, but he had a terrible apocalyptic view of the country. In the part on the Ottawa River, he just suddenly left his text and started writing about what he felt about today's young people. And he said, it was the fate of my generation to have been born in the death throes of a civilization. A little further on, he said, I literally swam in the broth of students in the most harassed university in the land, and I could not have dodged their anger if I had tried. I learned that they were rejecting, either with fury or with despair, nearly all the values. What a horrible way to look at the country and the rivers. He had no hope. Well, I began looking at the St. Lawrence River, of course. A beautiful river that spreads out from, as we all know, the Château Frontenac, went out to Ile Grove, where in 1847 more than 5,000 poor Irish people died of typhoid. There's a mass grave there of over 7,000 Irish. And if you stand at the memorial and look at it, they have the names up. And the one that absolutely stunned me was, you come to a list and there are 10 Mary Kellys. Mary Kellys who were babies, Mary Kellys who were children, mothers, sisters, grandmothers. It just moves you so much. There's so much history to a river like that. Did the Ottawa River, again, a river of great history because of the lumber trade, but it was also the venue that allowed the explorers to go overland and get into the deeper heart of Canada. Now it's recreational, that's just a ferry. And then I did the Muskoka River because I'm from that part of the country. It's the land of what they call hockey player cottages. You know, cottages listed for $7 to $11 to $12 million and bought. It's a place where tourism really took off in this country, summer tourism. But there are also issues there now. They want to build more dams around Balor, for example, to make power so that there's a movement there. Every river you go to, there is always an issue or several issues. Did the Grand River as well, where some people have it cleaned up to the point where they have fly fishing returned and quite successfully, where other people are deeply concerned about what bottled water is doing to the water that is underneath the ground there. So there's a big controversy there. The Niagara River, our most famous river, I suppose, the Maid of the Mist there. The issue there at the moment is that the Americans plan to close off their half of it. They're already printing up T-shirts that say, I was there when Niagara ran dry. Did the Red River, which is famous, of course, for its flooding. And what I learned there was how much the people of the Red River Valley love their homes. They would never leave it. And that's another thing that you learn each time you go to a river. No matter how much the troubles are, no matter how big the issues are, the people who live in those river valleys and those waterlands absolutely adore where they live. And they will fight for them. Did the Bow River, which of course is not far from here. This is a picture taken, this is very close to Bob's home actually. This is the Bow Glacier. It was a picture taken by the Vaux family 100 years ago. And 100 years later, the grandson of the original Vaux went back and took the same picture. So look at it there to see how deep the glacier is, and look at it 100 years later. You get a sense of what's going on. That river is almost running out of its glacial feed. Did the Fraser River, and they call it the Mighty Fraser for good reason. You've probably seen Hell's Gate, you've seen the fury of the water. The search and rescue people in Hope took me out in their jet boat, 435 horsepower. And when we got up to the canyon, the Fraser Canyon, the boat could hardly move. It was just unbelievable, the power. It was like being tossed around like a poo stick. I couldn't believe the force of some of these rivers. We forget how powerful they were in their original state, and many remain in the state they're in today. This is Barry Gannon. And Barry has been a volunteer for 31 years with the Search and Rescue Mission. And I asked Barry, I said, that's a long time to be doing this kind of work. It must be tough. I said, but how many people have you rescued, Barry? Well, actually, none. People go into the Fraser, they don't come out. He said, maybe we should be called Search and Retrieve. A reminder again of how powerful these rivers can be. I did the Gatineau River, which is nearby because it was one of the original forestry rivers, also because the Algonquins, Kitigan-Zibi, are very concerned about how the American eel, which they've long held as subsistence food, is not really available anymore because it can't get by the dams on the Ottawa River and on the Gatineau. That's just another picture of the beauty of this river. I did the Des Moines because it's one of the few wild rivers that is accessible to people in the southern part of Canada. There are lots of wild rivers, as we know, some of the more famous ones like Nahanni, but the Des Moines is a spectacular river as well. This is Wally Shaber, one of Canada's best-known canoeists, who is trying to work up a system now where there can be government protection of the entire watershed of the Des Moines, and there will never be any dams on it, nor should there ever be. I did the Rideau because it's one of the National Historic Sites, a UNESCO site, a river and a canal system that cost 2,000 lives during the building of it, and now is just a tourist attraction built for military reasons, never used for military reasons. And I've done the Mackenzie River, which you know well, and just heard a magnificent talk about the delta and the complications that are up there, the pipeline not probably going through now, but there's all kinds of other issues. And I did the Don River because I wanted to do a river, that's the river near Toronto, which is probably the most abused in all of North America. And one of the great examples of the abuse of this river, which has had its channels changed, it has been redirected to allow for the Don Valley Parkway, has been subjected to all kinds of chemical abuse. When Princess Margaret was coming over for a royal visit in 1957, they were quite concerned because one of the episodes she was going to be involved in was to visit with children at a small park. And the arrival was going to be she would walk across a very small little wooden bridge, and the children would see her and stand up and start singing. But they were so worried about the stink of the river that they timed it perfectly, and they dumped hundreds of gallons of this in the river to make sure, and timed it perfectly so that as she strode across that river, the smell of perfume wafted up from beneath. This is how they cured pollution in those days. Today, there are people, really good people, volunteers mostly, who work all the time for the restoration of the Don and saving what is there, and they've had some progress. This spring, for example, a family of mink was found on the banks of the Don River. Unthinkable 10 years ago. The rivers that haven't appeared yet in the Globe and Mail are the St. John, the North Saskatchewan, the Columbia. We get into all the problems. I don't really need to list them there. There's some of the listings which you all know about and are concerned about, but, let's go back to Dr. McLennan. And let's go back to what he said. It was the fate of my generation to have been born in the death throes of a civilization. What about today's generation? Not us, but the people much younger than us, the people coming to full life right now. This is Robin Hamlin. She lives in Kingston. When she was 11 years old, she started going around talking to local town councils. Now she travels around the country talking to councils about what they need to do about their waste management systems. She's concerned about plastic microbeads. She's extraordinarily concerned about bottled water and why, when it's not necessary, it's fine if it's necessary, but when it's not necessary, there is so much of it, and it's such a massive market. These young men are teenagers, Louis Alexandre de Gaspé-Beaubien and his cousin Aidan, and they belong to a very famous family in Quebec called the de Gaspé-Beaubien. And they have a foundation that has something like $770 million in it. And they've done all sorts of good things as it's gone down through the generations. They've built hospitals, for example. They've done all the kind of community stuff that you would think of. And they went to the grandchildren a couple of years ago, and they said, this is passing on to you now. You're next in line. What are you going to do for your country? Well, Aidan thought maybe bumblebees would be a good idea for to research them and try to find out what's going wrong with our honeybees. But then they talked together, and Aidan came up with a second idea, which Louis Alexandre thought, great, we'll do something about water. Water is life, and we'll just do it. We'll try to get young people engaged with it. And they started this with the river keepers in St. Lawrence River and in the Ottawa River, aqua hacking, where they brought together all kinds of experts. And then after the experts had talked to the young people went to their computers and their contacts and tried to organize and started looking at ways that perhaps they can fix their rivers that need fixing. And I went to young Louis Alexandre after he's 16 years old. And I took him outside and I started interviewing him because I wanted to hear his thoughts on it. And I said to young Louis, I said, you know the old saying, don't you? Rags to rags in 3 generations, because it was his grandfather who had created it. There he is with his grandfather as he's opening the Ottawa Conference. And this 16-year-old looks me straight in the eye and he says, I've been brought up in a family where the 3rd generation isn't allowed to piss it away. And you know what I took out of that? There is hope. Thank you.